Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're diving into a really critical, honestly transformative phase of military history that spanned from June 1990 to 1995. Now, this period is known as Eelam War II, and, it isn't just another chapter in a long conflict. It actually represents a fundamental shift in how war was waged on the island of Sri Lanka. So, let's kick things off by thinking about the core question that really defined this brutal transformation. What actually happens when a grassroots insurgent force evolves into a full-blown conventional challenger? We're going to track this evolution together to understand exactly how the LTTE systematically altered the entire geometry of the battlefield. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll quickly cover the breakdown of peace, the shift to conventional warfare, the siege at Elephant Pass, the assassination campaign, the human cost, and finally, the strategic consequences. Let's get right into it. Starting off with Section 1, the breakdown of peace. Let's look at the spark that lit the powder keg. Picture the critical window of early 1990. Following the total withdrawal of the Indian peacekeeping force, there was this brief, incredibly tense interlude of peace talks. But as you'll see, this window was really short-lived. By June, the negotiations completely broke down, and the conflict violently re-erupted. So why did it shatter so quickly? Well, the truth is, neither side was really preparing for a lasting peace. They basically used this brief pause strictly to rebuild their own military capabilities and wipe out their internal threats. The Sri Lankan government poured its resources into cracking down on the JVP insurgency down in the south, and simultaneously, the LTTE was ruthlessly destroying rival Tamil insurgent groups. It's kind of like they were both clearing their own backyards, securing their rears, so they were fully primed for a much heavier conflict. Which brings us to Section 2, the shift to conventional warfare. Once those rival groups were eliminated and the peace was shattered, the nature of the battlefield completely transformed, and the tactical shift here was stark. Before 1990, the insurgency relied mostly on hit-and-run guerrilla cells, classic asymmetrical warfare. But then they made this drastic pivot to conventional, mobile warfare. The LTTE actually started deploying large, highly organized formations. Their new aggressive objective was to actively target and overrun isolated Sri Lanka army detachments all across the northern province. And we can clearly track the massive escalation of these conventional assaults. Right in June and July of 1990, the LTTE successfully overran the army detachment at Kokaville. Then, by September, they launched this massive attack on Mullaitivu, which required a highly complex amphibious rescue by the Sri Lankan Air Force to relieve them. And at the exact same time, the heavily fortified garrison at Jaffna Fort was kept under a crushing siege until the Air Force finally managed to break through. The intense pressure of these coordinated, large-scale assaults was honestly just too much for the existing defensive infrastructure. The sheer weight of this new conventional warfare model ultimately forced the Sri Lankan Air Force to completely pack up and vacate several strategic bases. We're talking Kokaville, Mankalam, Thale Manar, and Kondachi. The map of territorial control was literally being redrawn overnight. Moving right along to Section 3, the siege at Elephant Pass. Let's look at a specific case study that perfectly anchors this whole concept of conventional hybrid warfare. The siege of Elephant Pass, which is a critical strategic choke point, really highlighted the monumental scale of this new type of war. By July 1991, the LTTE had amassed some seriously formidable conventional firepower. On July 10th, they didn't just lay siege to a small outpost. They went after a full Sri Lanka Army battalion. It took exactly a month and a massive sea-led relief force to finally break that siege. This proved, without a doubt, that the LTTE could now challenge state forces head-on at critical geographic gateways. Now, parallel to all this, we have Section 4, the assassination campaign. Because while these conventional battlefield engagements were happening, a high-profile, absolutely devastating strategy of leadership targeting was well underway. A relentless wave of attacks successfully targeted the absolute highest echelons of both Sri Lankan and Indian leadership. On May 21, 1991, former Prime Minister of India Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated by a suicide bomber. Then, in August 1992, a mine blast in Jaffna wiped out top military brass, including a lieutenant general, a major general, and a rear admiral. That very same month, the chief of the Sri Lankan Navy, Vice Admiral Clancy Fernando, was killed by a suicide bomber. And then, on May 1, 1993, Sri Lankan President Ranasinghe Premadasa was assassinated, again by a suicide bomber. The introduction of suicide bombers to systematically dismantle state leadership added a terrifying new dimension to the conflict.
Next up is Section 5, the human cost.
It's vital that we neutrally document these facts because beyond the battlefields and the political leadership, the civilian death toll during this period was catastrophic. The historical record reveals horrific, grisly violence committed against innocent civilians and surrendered personnel by both sides. In June 1990, LTTE Eastern cadres executed over 600 police officers who had actually surrendered for safe passage. On the other side, the Sri Lanka Army massacred at least 184 Tamil refugees in Batticaloa in September 1990, and another 152 Tamil civilians following a mine attack in Kakadikchole in June 1991. Then, fast forward to October 1992, the LTT attacked the Muslim village of Palya-Zagodela, killing between 109 and 285 civilians. Both sides engaged in severe atrocities, completely eroding their moral standing and tearing apart the civilian fabric of the entire region.
Finally, Section 6, strategic consequences. Where does all this lead?
Let's zero in on understanding the motive behind the highest-profile action of this era, the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. According to the historical record, LTTE leader Pravakaran viewed Gandhi's potential political resurgence and a possible return to the Prime Minister's office not just as a political hurdle, but as a direct existential threat to the Tamil cause and his dream of an independent Eelam. So the assassination was engineered as a drastic, preemptive strike. But here is the critical takeaway. That tactical success sparked a massive, irreversible backfire. While the LTTE achieved their immediate goal of eliminating a perceived threat, the strategic consequence was an absolute disaster for them. The killing of a former Indian prime minister permanently alienated the Indian government, totally undermining any residual state support for their movement. So, pulling this all together, Eelam War II leaves us with a really clear, interconnected picture of military evolution. We learned that an insurgent force can indeed scale up to match conventional armies in mobile warfare and massive sieges. We saw how precision targeting of state leadership creates massive institutional voids, and how grisly atrocities deeply erode moral legitimacy. But perhaps most importantly, the tactical assassination of Rajiv Gandhi proved that international isolation vastly outweighs short-term gains on the ground. I'll leave you with this provocative thought to consider regarding the tragic paradox of Eelam War II. We've seen a timeline where an insurgent group builds incredible conventional strength and executes flawless tactical strikes, yet ultimately sows the seeds of its own international isolation. So ask yourself, how does a devastating string of tactical victories ultimately lead to fatal strategic isolation? It's a profound lesson in the limits of military power when it gets completely divorced from geopolitical reality. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. And as always, keep questioning the history behind the headlines.